Mikey's curse. I was fascinated by this strange mother and son. But back then, grown-ups dismissed kids' curiosity as nosiness. Even if I'd told grandma or mom about their conversations, I would have gotten a light swat on the behind, a playful scolding, and that would be the end of it. A 5 or 6-year-old's mind is full of questions. Everything is a mystery waiting to be unraveled. So naturally, I kept an eye on Mikey. When I was little, I lived with my grandma. On sweltering summer days, I'd escape the heat in her tiny apartment in what you might call the projects. A maze of narrow alleyways, barely wide enough for 3 people to walk side by side, crisscrossed the neighborhood. Each alley housed a dozen or more families in low-slung, one-story buildings. Grandma, with her 6 daughters, had carved out an even tinier space on the top floor as an extra room. I remember my uncle cramming himself up there during his high school finals. It was damp, stuffy, and smelled of mildew. Even in late fall, you'd break out in a sweat after a few minutes. Most of the houses were self-built, ramshackle but sturdy, and always dim. Even in broad daylight, it was dark enough inside to lose your hand in front of your face. Still, for the folks living there, it was a step up from a shack or a tent. Every alley had a couple of passageways connecting it to the others, creating a network of narrow tunnels, like a field crisscrossed with irrigation ditches. The neighborhood kids, big and small, ran wild. Marbles in the spring, pogs in the summer, spinning tops in the fall, snowball fights in the winter. Their days were spent dreaming up new ways to play. You could always find a pack of sweaty, dirt-streaked kids tearing through the alleys, sometimes colliding with busy adults who'd bark a quick warning before getting back to their chores. This labyrinth was, of course, the perfect playground for hide and seek. And whenever I think of hide and seek, I think of Mikey. Mikey and his mom, a thin, pale woman, were new to the neighborhood. They'd moved into the apartment next door to Grandma's when the previous tenants left town. Mikey's mom was an odd duck. Summer or winter, she always wore a faded floral blouse and thin brown pants. Every day, she'd clutch a handful of birdseed, calling to her scrawny chickens, even skinnier than she was. She kept to herself, scraping by selling handmade wicker baskets and other crafts at the flea market. A constant air of sadness clung to her, like someone carrying a heavy secret or a kid waiting to be punished. Her sallow skin and dry, bluish lips were unsettling. Whenever her son came home, her eyes held a mix of resentment and fear that contradicted her outwardly caring actions. Her voice was always low, as if muffled by a curtain or coming from deep underground. On hot days, it sounded like the rasping of a dying cicada. Even though she wasn't one for socializing, I often heard her talking to her son. It was mostly one-sided. She'd talk, he'd rarely answer. But sometimes, I'd catch bits and pieces of their conversations, usually in the evenings, when Mikey came home from playing. A few times, woken up by the need to pee, I'd hear noises from their apartment and sneak to their window to eavesdrop. Their conversations were strange, even confusing. "Leave me alone. What do you want from me? When will you finally go away? Why are you still here?" These were her usual questions, always met with Mikey's same, simple answer: no. Grandma's neighborhood had once been thick woods. Over 100 years ago, towards the end of the 19th century, a group of fishermen had settled there, founding what became known as Foundersville. The reason for the name had long been forgotten, passed down through generations out of habit. Kids between 5 and 9 were a dime a dozen in that neighborhood, so playtime was a constant. Since everyone was more or less in the same boat, financially speaking, there was a natural camaraderie among the kids. It didn't take Mikey long to fit in, except he was a little strange. Mikey had a large head and unusually flat features. From a distance, he looked like a red balloon, inflated and then painstakingly drawn with a face. A few strands of oily hair clung to his large, round skull. Beneath his thin, pale skin, the color of sheets bleached too many times, you could see the network of purplish veins like tiny straws. His eyes were small, with sparse lashes, making them look like 2 peas embedded in dough. He had a habit of squinting when he talked. His nose was short, wide, and slightly concave, and his thick lips were perpetually curled upwards in a sneer. Mikey's mom, despite often going without food herself, made sure he had meat or fish every day. When they were really broke, she'd catch frogs in the nearby pond with her bare hands, enduring the stinging toxins on their skin to feed her son. We were all incredibly envious. Mikey didn't talk much, but when he did, he spoke with an adult-like seriousness, often lecturing us, and for some reason we usually listened. His exposed skin had a strange, translucent puffiness like thin pigskin. His hands were always damp. Whenever I held his hand, it felt slippery, like a bar of soap. Whenever we played hide and seek, he always found us. No matter where we hid, under the pickup truck, inside wicker baskets, in dark closets, or high up in the trees. We'd think we'd found the perfect hiding spot, only to have him appear moments later. He'd always materialize behind you, tap you heavily on the shoulder, and say with a chilling smirk, "I see you." According to the rules, the person who was found was supposed to be it next. But Mikey never wanted to hide, and we were always happy to let him keep seeking. Of course, a game like that loses its fun when it becomes unbalanced. When Mikey's enthusiasm for another round was met with eye rolls and groans, the other kids would scatter, leaving just me and him. He'd squint after their retreating figures, saying nothing. "How do you always find us?" I asked him one day as we walked home together. "You're all idiots. I've hidden in all those places a million times," he replied, his usual blunt self. I was used to it. "So, is there a way to hide so someone can never find you?" I asked as he reached for the wooden door of his apartment. This time, he didn't answer right away. He paused, his hand hovering over the doorknob. Then, he grinned and stepped closer, reaching out and placing his thumbs over my eyes. "You blind them, like this. Press hard, and they'll never find you." His words were like tiny drills, and his thumbs began to press harder, a growing pressure against my eyeballs. Being only 5, I naturally burst into tears. Mikey seemed to realize he'd gone too far. He quickly withdrew his hands and slipped inside, leaving me rubbing my sore eyes. Couldn't sleep that night. Instead of Grandma's and Mom's usual lullaby of murmurs and snores, Mikey's words echoed in my mind. "Blind them. What a creep," I muttered, tossing and turning. The night felt unusually hot. The evening breeze, normally cool and refreshing, was still and stifling. A pressure in my lower abdomen told me I needed to pee. I climbed out of my bamboo bed, rubbing my still tender eyes, and headed for the bathroom. As I mentioned, the alleyways were narrow, and in the summer, the apartments became like ovens. Everyone dragged their mattresses and mats outside to sleep. Grandma's apartment was at the end of the alley, and none of the apartments had bathrooms. Grown-ups had to walk 100 yards to the public restrooms, while kids just used the gutters. As I stepped outside, I noticed the moon was up. Carefully picking my way through the clutter of sleeping bodies and belongings, I suddenly realized something. I hadn't really paid attention before, maybe because my eyes were hurting that day, but now, something seemed off. From where I stood, I could see figures lying outside every doorway down the alley. They lay motionless, like stacked merchandise, their individual forms blurring together. The silvery moonlight, filtering through cracks in the tattered awnings, glinted off their bare skin with an eerie luminescence. I'd once seen a delivery of mannequins for a clothing store near our apartment. A pile of naked, plastic figures sprawled on the sidewalk, much like this scene. As a kid, I'd been startled, barely able to distinguish them from real people. But after I finished peeing, I noticed that no one was sleeping outside Mikey's apartment. In fact, ever since they'd moved in, no matter how hot it got, they never slept outside. They always finished dinner early and shut themselves in. I was about to go investigate when Mikey's door creaked open. A figure slipped out, bent double, then straightened up and quietly closed the door. I ducked behind a stack of lawn chairs and peered closer. It was Mikey's mom. Her face, turned towards me, held a look of exhilarated relief, like a prisoner released from jail or a gambler awaiting the final hand. She clutched a small duffel bag, the same one she'd carried when they arrived. She glanced nervously back at the apartment, then carefully stepped over the sleeping forms in the alley. It wasn't easy. She seemed hesitant, choosing the side of the alley closest to me, passing right by my hiding spot and disappearing into the night. Luckily, in her haste, she didn't notice me. I was still wondering why she'd snuck out so late at night when the door to their apartment opened again. Mikey stepped out. His eyes, not small and beady like in the daytime, were wide and luminous, like a cat's. "You can't go," he whispered, his voice surprisingly deep, like a grown man's, similar to my grandpa's. "I like playing hide and seek." He slipped back inside. A chill ran down my spine, erasing the lingering heat of the day. I rubbed my arms, suddenly covered in goosebumps, and scrambled back to bed. The next morning, woken up by my family, I was getting ready for breakfast when I saw Mikey's mom handing him a bowl of noodles topped with a fried egg. He sat perched on a milk crate, a smug look on his face. The steam rising from the noodles was clearly visible, but Mikey slurped them down as if they were cold, barely chewing, the bowl empty in seconds. His mom didn't seem surprised. She just snatched the empty bowl, biting her lip. Mikey, finished eating, darted outside, reminding me to hurry up and join him to play. The events of the previous night felt unreal, like a dream. I convinced myself that I'd imagined it all. A few days later, as the summer heat began to fade, my time at Grandma's was coming to an end. It was my last day. Mikey, when he heard I was leaving, just shrugged and then rounded up the other kids for a game of hide and seek. The other kids, with nothing better to do, agreed to play. The outcome was predictable. Mikey found everyone without fail. Amidst the other kids' groans of frustration, I walked home with Mikey. After dinner, everyone turned in early. In the dead of night, the wind shifted, suddenly cold, like a razor blade against my skin. I reached blindly for my blanket, but instead, my hand closed around something round and fleshy. I opened my eyes to find Mikey crouching beside my bed. My hand was resting on his head. He stared at me, eyes wide, nostrils flaring. I yelped, but he quickly clamped a hand over my mouth. "Come with me," he whispered and turned to leave. As if in a trance, I followed. The bustling daytime street was deserted and silent. Back then, there were no late-night hangouts like bars or internet cafes. Even TVs were a luxury for the few who could afford them. Except for the occasional night watchman, the streets were empty. My footsteps and Mikey's echoed on the asphalt, still radiating the day's heat. He walked at a steady pace, neither fast nor slow. After a while, we left Foundersville behind, passing the old grain elevator and the convenience store. "Where are we going?" I finally asked. "Looking for someone. She wants to play hide and seek with me," he replied without turning around. "Looking for who?" I mumbled. This time, Mikey didn't answer. He just chuckled, his plump shoulders shaking, the extra flesh at the back of his neck rippling. I was almost asleep on my feet when I bumped into Mikey. He'd stopped. "You can't hide from me," he said suddenly. I stared at him, confused, then realized he wasn't talking to me. He was talking to a figure huddled beside the closed convenience store. "I'll follow you forever," Mikey continued. We were at an intersection connecting the main road to the neighborhood, completely deserted. "I have to try," the figure said, rising and clutching a bundle of clothes. It was Mikey's mom. "You're leaving tomorrow, right?" Mikey suddenly turned, a small smile playing on his lips as he looked at me. I nodded dumbly. "You're the only one who's ever been nice to me," he said, reaching out as if to pat my head, like a grown-up would. "What are you doing?" his mother shrieked, her voice like nails on a chalkboard. Mikey's hand froze in mid-air. I instinctively sensed danger radiating from him. I ran to his mother's side. She pushed me behind her. "I'm tired of this body," Mikey whispered, his hands gripping his head. "Why do you always play hide and seek with me? I told you you can't win. I'll always find you, no matter where you hide." He walked towards us, his hands outstretched as if to grab us. I could feel his mother trembling. "Hide, hide, and I'll come find you. I told you, finding people is my favorite game," Mikey said, his lips stretched into a wide grin. "Run." We have to get away from him. His mother grabbed my hand and pulled me down the empty street. Looking back, Mikey hadn't moved. He just pointed at us. We ran to several different places, but each time, before we could even catch our breath, Mikey would emerge from the shadows. "Found you again. Run. Hide." His mother would cry, her voice laced with panic, pulling me along. We ran until we were both exhausted, me practically dragging my feet as she pulled me along. We collapsed against the railing of a pedestrian overpass, gasping for air. "Give up." Mikey's voice came from between the bars of the railing. He was grinning. "I'm not running anymore." With a sudden burst of strength, his mother lunged, pinning Mikey's neck against the ground. But he kept grinning. "I'm a traitor, not a killer. I've never killed anyone before. I've put up with you long enough. You'll be the first." "The first? Really?" Mikey's voice was strained. A thin, reedy sound, like a faucet about to run dry. "Blind him, then he won't be able to find us." I don't know why, but these words suddenly popped into my head, and I blurted them out involuntarily. The woman seemed to understand. She actually extended her thumb and pressed it towards Mikey's eye socket. A stream of bright red blood spurted from his eye socket, splattering the woman. But Mikey, as if feeling no pain, just smiled. He didn't resist at all. After a moment, he finally lay motionless on the ground. The woman, using her last bit of strength, dragged me forward as she ran, muttering sarcastically. I looked back. Mikey lay there, unmoving. Finally, both of us were completely spent, collapsing on the ground, gasping for air. The woman's voice seemed to have recovered. "I just saved your life, kid," she said, turning to me smugly. "Isn't Mikey your son?" I asked, struggling to catch my breath, confused as to why a mother and son could be like this. "He's not my son." The woman scowled, her face like a demon's, her fists clenched tight. "I thought he was just merchandise, but he turned out to be like a dog's skin plaster I couldn't get rid of," she continued to complain. Then, seeing my bewildered expression, she waved her hand dismissively. "Why am I telling you this? You wouldn't understand, little brat." She stood up and stretched. "He shouldn't show up again, talking about hide and seek every day, that damned brat. I've blinded you, now let's see how you find me." Having said that, she suddenly narrowed her eyes at me, like a hungry demon eyeing its food, causing me to shrink back involuntarily. "Come with Auntie. Auntie will take you to play." She reached out towards me. I desperately shook my head and backed away. She cursed angrily and then ignored me. "Where are you going?" I asked as she turned. I noticed she suddenly hunched over with great effort. "None of your business." She moved her neck strangely. "Why does my hair feel like it's being pulled?" I suddenly noticed a plump, pale hand, filled with blue veins like the meridians on a dried leaf, reaching out from around the woman's neck. I looked up. Mikey, his heavy body pressing down on the woman's back, was grinning broadly. One hand gripped the woman's hair, the other was placed over his mouth, gesturing for me to be quiet. But something felt wrong. Mikey's face didn't have any injuries, but blood was clearly still dripping from the woman's hand from earlier. The woman seemed oblivious. She continued down the street. After a few steps, she moved her neck again. "Wherever you go, I can find you." A whisper-like voice, Mikey's voice, suddenly pierced my ears. I didn't go home. I sat there until dawn, my legs weak. When I returned home in the morning, I was scolded. My grandmother and mother were terrified, but thankfully nothing had happened to me, so they let it go. Not long after, I heard the police came, holding a warrant and searching for Mikey's mother, or rather, the woman. "Who was that person?" I asked my mother. "That woman was a human trafficker specializing in trading children a few years old, around your age. She tricked children into gathering together, then took them to the countryside to sell. But once, at night, the driver fell asleep at the wheel, and the car overturned into a river. All the children drowned, and they weren't discovered for several days. When they were pulled out, their heads were swollen like steamed buns, the blue veins on their heads bulging. More than 10 children, their lips blue and purple, their eyes squeezed shut by the swollen skin on their foreheads, their whole bodies soaked and translucent like radishes. That day, the police brought the warrant and told everyone what had happened, and everyone learned how cruel that woman was. She had a child of her own, yet she did such a wicked thing. It's a pity they haven't caught her yet, my mother explained angrily. Mikey wasn't her son, I blurted out. My mother looked puzzled, but continued, regardless of her. The police said that before someone reported her, she seemed to have tricked another child and often kept him with her, probably wanting to take him as her son. She did so many bad things. Maybe she couldn't have children anymore. My mother scolded again. After that, she hurried off to do her own thing. Later, I went back to my grandmother's house. Someone else was living there now. The woman was nowhere to be found. Later, I overheard neighbors gossiping about seeing a thin woman with a large-headed son in another town. But they were never caught. It was like they were playing hide and seek with the police. After that, I often had the same dream. In the dream, I saw a group of children playing hide and seek in the distance. The children laughed and hid, except for one who was leaning against a wall with his back to everyone, covering his eyes and counting. I happily walked towards them, wanting to join in. The child leaning against the wall suddenly turned around. He had no eyes. In their place were only dried patches of blood, pulling his eyelids and forehead taut, forming deep wrinkles like ravines. That face was Mikey's. Terrified, I retreated step by step in the dream. The children who had hidden before suddenly emerged from their hiding places and slowly walked towards me. They were all Mikey, all with the same swollen, large head, squinting eyes, blue and purple lips, and soaked bodies. "Come play hide and seek," they chanted innocently. I woke up with a start, drenched in sweat. I seemed to understand how the woman could never escape Mikey.